Greetings and welcome to The Phantom Thief, an Illustrated History. My name is Elena. I will be your tour guide on this deep dive into literary and world history. However, I do have a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Normally, when I do this presentation at conventions, it is a very video-heavy presentation, which is not usually a problem because it's protected under educational fair use because it's a very educational presentation. However, because it's being streamed online and because DMCA bots don't actually care about fair use, they will flag your video regardless. We have been asked not to stream any copyrighted material. So the good news is 2 of my clips are in the public domain because they were produced before 1923. Unfortunately, only 2 of my clips are in the public domain, so I am not going to be able to show you some of the adaptations, which normally I use that as a point to discuss how the source material has changed over the years and how it's reflected and, a lot of that stuff. So we're going to talk about the history. We're going to focus mostly on the history. I will still give you the titles of the things I would have shown you videos of, and of course you're welcome to do additional research on your own, or just come see my presentation when I do it in person at a con, because I do this fairly frequently at conventions when we're having conventions. So, without further ado, let's get started with the presentation. So, what is a Phantom Thief? Phantom Thieves have begun showing up in all kinds of media, and they turn up in things as diverse as Pokemon, Persona 5, card games, children's cartoons, all sorts of things. They're typically known as gentleman thieves or mysterious thieves if they are not called a phantom thief. In Japan, the term that is most commonly used is kaito. They are usually very flamboyant, they are showy, they want to show off, and they can be kind of a diva in some cases, and they sometimes fill the role of an anti-hero, or at least a not quite villainous person. Think more Robin Hood. So they're not out so much for personal gain. They sometimes have ulterior motives to help people. They usually have a code of conduct of some kind. Frequently that takes the form of a refusal to use violence, or they'll only rob criminals, they won't rob poor people, that sort of thing. A lot of times the aesthetic that is associated with them is Victorian or Edwardian in style. That's not universal, but it's very common. So you will often see them wearing capes, wearing top hats, wearing white gloves, carrying a cane, that sort of thing. And in some cases, they give notice by announcing what they're going to steal before they do it, or they warn their victims of what they're going to do. And they use disguise, they use trickery, they have very elaborate plans, very elaborate schemes. They don't just go in and smash and grab, they set this up in advance and plan everything out carefully. And often in media, they have a rival, which frequently takes the form of a frustrated police detective. And as I mentioned, these are very stylish characters who have shown up in all different countries all around the world. However, the archetype actually stems from a lot of the same literary sources, so we are going to talk through some of that development through history. And not every single character we're going to talk about checks every box on this list, because there's been a lot of development, from the original sources to present day. Things have changed a lot, but you're going to see some of the same themes repeated over and over, even in ones that don't necessarily look like the originals. We're going to skip this video because I can't show it. However, just in this screenshot from the start of the video, you can see this is a character who, despite being extremely anime stylized, does have a top hat and cape. And you can watch that series, I think, on Crunchyroll currently. So, where did all of this start? Because thief characters have obviously been around in literature for thousands of years. The stories of Robin Hood date back to the 14th century. Some folkloric thieves can be traced all the way back to the Bronze Age. But the phantom thief trope can actually be traced to one particular era. Now, a little caveat, we are going to be bouncing around a little bit in history based on what themes we're talking about, so don't assume everything is going to be in strict chronological order, but I will give you warning when we're moving back in time. So, welcome to the Gilded Age. This period, which covered approximately the last third of the Victorian through the first half of the Edwardian era, approximately, was characterized by a whole lot of industrial development. So that led to the redistribution of wealth throughout the populace and the appearance of a larger, wealthier middle class, which is something that hadn't really been around before. The people who had money went to a great deal of effort to show it off. Elaborate clothing and jewelry were in fashion. It was socially required. If you were, above middle class, you were required to change clothes several times per day. So ladies of quality, or in Europe, the nobility, had morning dresses and walking dresses and tea gowns and riding habits and dinner gowns. And, you were expected to wear all of these on any given day. You dressed appropriate to your activity. So that it was not, in higher society circles, it was not, I have a good dress and a less good dress. It was, I have 12 different kinds of good dresses and I will wear all of them. For historical context, this is the period that led up to the construction of the Titanic, which was not in any way shy about showing off wealth and being flashy. And for any British TV fans, the period wrapped up right about the time of the first season of Downton Abbey. So you can use that as your mental image of the aesthetic and the flashiness that went into this. In the United States, post-Civil War restoration was shifting into full-scale industrial expansion. So industrial concerns like railroads, coal, steel, timber were producing billionaire dynasties whose names we still remember today. People like these guys and a bunch of others like them. This was the era of railroad tycoons and robber barons and rich financiers, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Leland Stanford, a whole bunch of these people whose names you recognize from banks and institutions that exist to this day. A lot of universities, a lot of banks, and these are the men who founded those institutions. And to give you an idea of just how rich these guys were, because it's really hard to put it in modern day dollars because there's not an exact formula to follow. George Vanderbilt, who was a relative of the Vanderbilts, constructed the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina between 1889 and 1895 at a cost of around $19 million. Adjusted for inflation as best we can, that's the equivalent of almost $500 million in today's money. And George Vanderbilt was considered the poor relation of the Vanderbilt family. So just imagine building yourself a $500 million mansion and your entire extended family is like, "Oh, that's cute, dear. Is that your little vacation home?" These people accounted for a staggering amount of money. And a lot of people didn't like them because they had a lot of money. It's your 1%ers. So that's what was going on financially. And during the Gilded Age, many of the richest men in the country were perceived to have made their money by manipulating politics or exploiting poor workers, which meant public sympathy was often with the underdog rather than with those who were viewed as having taken advantage of them. Now, just to be fair, even though that was the public view, while there were certainly problems of wage inequality and worker exploitation during this era, because this is when the unions were on the rise because workers were not being treated well. But a lot of the people at the top were also philanthropists as well as businessmen. So Andrew Carnegie, for example, donated 90% of his wealth to charity. He built more than 1,700 libraries all across America to make education more accessible to all social classes. John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated about 50% of his net worth. He helped establish the USO. He donated the land for UN headquarters. Carnegie, Mellon, Rockefeller, and Stanford all founded universities. Diamond Jim Brady was known to hand out valuable jewelry as tips to waitstaff in restaurants. He was incredibly rich. He collected jewels, but he was not afraid to just give it away to people. In fact, I have a necklace myself made from a stick pin that my great-grandfather received from Diamond Jim when he waited on him in a restaurant. So these are not just myths. These are real stories. So not all of the super rich were horrible money-grubbing tycoons. Some of them definitely were, and we have the term robber baron for a reason. But it was a mix. People were some of them were very greedy and some of them were more charitable. Carnegie in particular had the gospel of wealth, is the term that he used, which basically was a philosophy that those who had money were under obligation to share it with those who didn't. So it was a mix. But there was definitely a lot of public opinion against these people because they were perceived to have, and there were a lot of people who had not. So we'll see that sort of public opinion start to seep into literature and media over the next few decades after this period, because it was a very strong feeling. And during this era, fiction was also becoming increasingly popular, thanks in part to General Lew Wallace's runaway bestseller Ben-Hur, which was published in 1880, which made novel reading more socially acceptable among the more conservative echelons of society. There was a debate going on during this period of whether or not it was moral for people to read novels. And obviously, a lot of people read novels. A lot of people read fiction of all types, but certain classes, certain groups of society, the more conservative bent, was concerned that reading things that weren't true, essentially, might cause people to degrade morally. There was a lot of strange stuff that went on during this era. Um, but in any case, fiction in general, and especially in the form of things like magazine serials and novels, was readily available to all classes because printing had gotten cheaper, dime novels and pulps were becoming more common. One of the most common ways that people got their fiction was in the form of magazine serials, which really famous writers like Charles Dickens, for example, published works serially, which meant, one chapter would come out with each periodical. So you would buy your whatever your favorite magazine was, and in the magazine it would contain one chapter of a novel. And then after all the chapters had been published, they were collected and sold in bookstores. But serial novels were really common. It's something that stopped happening around the 1950s or 1960s in the US and has actually started up again in some ways. So, now a lot of it is digital serialization, but it's still going on. Now, this was still the Victorian era. It was the end of the Victorian era, but it was still Victorian, so there were still a lot of social mores restricting what was quote unquote correct to read or discuss. But toward the end of the 19th century, popular culture began to see a kickback against those really strict social restrictions. Sensational fiction and true crime stories, some of it was quite graphic and shocking by modern standards, was all over the newsstands. A lot of it was illustrated in these really graphic, lurid engravings. And these would picture murder scenes or pools of blood or people being devoured by animals because it was sensationalized. It was just like the tabloids you see at the checkout counter today, except since it wasn't actually photographs, they could do whatever they wanted with it. So these are 1871 copies of the Illustrated Police News, which was a pseudo news journal that features a lot of interesting stories, all of them very salacious. So popular topics in this sort of periodical would be murders, marital scandals, wild animal attacks. In this picture, I don't know if it shows really well. Hopefully it does on the stream. But my favorite picture here is the upper right engraving, which is captioned, "A fearful attack on a steamer by alligators, several seamen devoured." And the engraving has 16 alligators swarming up the sides of the boat like something from a zombie apocalypse movie. Like it is utterly ridiculous. But that's the sort of thing that sold, so of course that's what they published. And here we have some coverage of the 1874 Whitechapel murder by Henry Wainwright, which at the time was actually given more press coverage than the Jack the Ripper murders. And, here's another account, "The Murder of Maria Martin in the Red Barn at Polstead," containing the whole account of the horrid murder committed by her lover and seducer William Corder, as revealed in a dream by her mother, and also a graphic account of his confession and execution. You could get all this for one penny. So, as you can see, this was sensationalized. And that's what people were getting used to. So from the very strict Victorian era moving toward the Edwardian era, you were getting a lot more shock value, a lot more drama in your quote unquote news. And there was no shortage of material for true crime aficionados because there were people like Adam Worth making headlines as well. Adam Worth was nicknamed the Napoleon of the criminal world. He was the real life inspiration for Arthur Conan Doyle's Professor Moriarty in the Sherlock Holmes stories, who was called the Napoleon of crime, which sounds like a totally different nickname. Worth was a thief who was credited with heisting an estimated $3 million during his career. That equates to roughly $71 million in today's money. Again, there's no exact formula, but as close as you can get it. And Adam Worth was essentially the real life template for the gentleman thief. So this is a guy who used a steam yacht and a dedicated crew to travel around the world committing crimes. He had a dual identity. He never revealed that he was a criminal to his wife or children. He refused to use violence. He wouldn't let any of his associates use violence. And if you worked with him on a job and you did something violent, he would break with you. And my favorite thing about him, he stole the world's most expensive painting, which was a Gainsborough portrait of the Duchess of Devonshire. He kept it in his bedroom hanging on the wall for 25 years, and then he returned it. He's like, well, I've had this on my wall for a while, but I'm tired of it now, so you can have it back. I mean, he's got attitude. He definitely has attitude. It wasn't just Worth doing things like that, though. Max Shinburn was a safecracker and bank robber who posed as an aristocrat, and later he purchased a baronial title in Belgium with part of the money he stole during his 9 years in the U.S., so he became a legit baron. Um, in 1869, he and his associates stole over $2.5 million in a single bank heist. That's about $60 million today, and at the time it was the biggest bank robbery take in history. He was repeatedly captured. He escaped from police custody or prison at least 8 times, suspected more. They think the police just stopped reporting when he did because it made him look bad. Um, and this is the guy, if you remember the Sherlock Holmes story, or if you've read any other stories that use this trick where the criminals rent the building next door and then tunnel under the floor up into the bank vault, this is the guy who invented that. Um, so unlike Adam Worth, he was not really the gentleman. He would use violence. He had a much less genteel reputation, and Worth reportedly did not get along with him at all. But this is the sort of crime that was going on. So even though you had the very over sensationalized, shocking news reports of murders and scandals and everything else, even your legit news reports had characters like this in them, and people were just in awe. You know, after a while, you start rooting for these guys because you see how dramatic they are. And apart from these two, there were a lot of other real life criminals pulling off really high end crimes during the 19th century, which contributed to the rise and popularity of private detective agencies, which hadn't existed much before the mid 19th century. Alan Pinkerton is probably the most famous detective in history in terms of, you know, people who were extremely influential and people who established the craft. He opened a detective agency around 1850. He came to prominence primarily after foiling an early assassination attempt against Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln used Pinkerton agents for his personal security before he was president and in the early days of his presidency, the first 3 years actually. Unfortunately, he did not retain the Pinkertons into 1865, and in fact, the guy who was on duty the night he was assassinated was next door drinking at the tavern, and he was a police officer who had been written up multiple times for failing to do his duty, and no one actually knows why he was assigned to Lincoln's security that night. I have questions. In any case, the Pinkertons were not on hand to stop the assassination when it happened. And the Pinkertons were the first really widespread and widely known detective agency. And if you've ever wondered where the term private eye came from, it is the Pinkerton logo. The "We Never Sleep" slogan and the open eye was their logo in the 19th century, and private eye was slang for a Pinkerton agent, and later on, after the Pinkertons were not the only detectives on the scene, it became slang for any private detective. Alan Pinkerton himself published 18 books about his own cases. He basically wrote his memoirs about his cases. That also fed into both the true crime craze and the growing market for detective fiction. And detectives in popular fiction got a boost from the Pinkerton Agency as well. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle included Pinkerton agents in the Sherlock Holmes stories and actually based some of his cases on Pinkerton cases. So while we're talking about fiction, let's jump back a bit, taking some time back and talking about the birth of mystery fiction. So shifting to a slightly different genre from true crime to mysteries. In the first half of the 19th century, short mystery stories began appearing in periodicals and anthologies all around the world. And while few of these mysteries followed what we would consider now to be the detective story formula, they were the precursors to the modern sort of whodunit caper. The birth of detective fiction as it is known now probably dates back to 1841, which was when Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue was published. And this is considered by some to be the first modern detective story. There were, in the 1830s, there were some other stories that may have technically predated, but this is the one that really is the first detective type story. In the 1830s, a series of sensationalist articles called Unpublished Passages in the Life of Vidocq, the French Minister of Police, were published in Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, to which Poe was a contributing writer. And Vidocq himself was a criminal turned lawman who's credited with coining the phrase, set a thief to catch a thief. And it's very possible that these highly embellished accounts of his life inspired Poe to write his own detective stories. Nobody can prove that. There's not any real obvious connection except that Poe worked for the same magazine, but it's very plausible. The Mystery of Marie Roget was based on the details of a real crime, the death of Mary Cecilia Rogers in New York City in 1841, and Edgar Allan Poe examined the reports of the crime, put forth his own theory of what might have happened to her in the form of fiction. And then a few years later, another writer, Charles Burdett, also incorporated facts from the same case into his novel The Gambler, which is considered the first American detective novel as opposed to short story. So that's where the start of mystery fiction happened. Many other authors introduced mystery stories in the years that followed. You have Charles Dickens has Police Murder Investigation in Bleak House, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. We will never know who did it because he died before finishing, but that was a serialized crime story that was ongoing when he died. Wilkie Collins is considered the father of the modern detective formula because he invented most of the genre cliches like the isolated country house and red herrings and the least likely suspect and so on. Those are the devices that were popularized to cliche level by the cozy mystery genre, of which Agatha Christie was the forerunner. And then now you walk into any bookstore, if you have a bookstore. Bookstores are a dying breed, but if you walk into one, there will be aisles and aisles and aisles of cozy fiction, which are feel-good murder stories is the only way to describe that. Cozy mysteries are, the person who gets killed is somebody nobody liked anyway, and then you just try to figure out who did it before the amateur detective does, or something. And then you have Monsieur Lecoq, who's another fictional detective, series of 5 novels in the late 1860s. He was the first detective who was skilled at disguising himself to go undercover, which is a talent later employed by another really famous detective. In 1887, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle introduced Sherlock Holmes in A Study in Scarlet. Sherlock Holmes was based on a real person, Dr. Joseph Bell, who was one of Conan Doyle's mentors, and reportedly was basically like he wrote Holmes. He could just figure things out from looking at people. A Study in Scarlet was, of course, the first appearance of Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes would go on to become the most famous detective in the English-speaking world. Although he temporarily killed the character off in 1893 because he got really sick of writing him, Conan Doyle brought him back and would continue to write Holmes' adventures for the next 40 years. The stories were absurdly popular, thanks in part to an actor named William Gillette, who played Holmes in over 1,000 stage performances and in a 1916 silent film. He's actually the one who established most of the Holmes cliches we recognize today, like the meerschaum pipe, the dressing gown, the general appearance. And William Gillette is the guy who more or less convinced Conan Doyle to continue writing about him after the author had lost interest. So after Conan Doyle killed Holmes off, Gillette wrote to him and said, "Hey, I'm actually having really good success with this character on stage. Can I just keep doing that?" And Conan Doyle was like, "Yeah, sure, write your own plays, that's fine." And eventually the popularity came back around and Doyle brought him back. And the interesting thing about the Sherlock Holmes cases is a lot of them used real cases from either the Pinkerton Agency or crimes of Adam Worth, for the basis of the stories, because Conan Doyle had to come up with all those mysteries somehow. A lot of them were based on true crime. And something that is not talked about a lot, but should be, is that a whole lot of female authors also found success in this genre. So in 1862, Mary Elizabeth Braddon published one of the best-selling crime novels of the 19th century, which was called Lady Audley's Secret. And she was followed by a whole string of women, but the reason people don't realize how many women there were is that they frequently wrote under male pseudonyms, because there was a lot of reader prejudice and people wouldn't buy books by a woman, and a lot of these women were also of fairly high social standing, and at the time high society regarded novel reading and certainly novel writing as a very frivolous pursuit. So this helped the writers avoid the judgment of their peers by writing under male pseudonyms or writing under false names. So all of these authors listed here are very successful crime authors. And they actually outsold many of the well-known male authors who were their contemporaries. One of the most successful female mystery writers was Baroness Orczy. Around the turn of the century, she wrote a series of short stories about the old man in the corner. This is an illustration from it on the screen here. He was an old guy who sat in a booth in a railway station playing with a ball of string, and people would bring him mysteries, and he would sit there and play with his string and solve the mysteries based on what they told him. Orczy also created Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, who was a female detective. There had been several previous female detectives by this point, including Anna Catherine Green's Amelia Butterworth in 1878. But Lady Molly was a notable one as well. Orczy would also later go on to create a lawyer detective character who was a master of disguise in a series called Skin of My Tooth. And the popularity of these stories just kept increasing and kept increasing all through the 1920s and 30s, leading into what is widely considered the golden age of detective fiction, which is Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers. Think about all of those classic mystery stories that have been adapted dozens of times. And concurrent with this trend, and often featured in the same publications, was yet another emerging literary genre, which was in fact also established by mystery writer Baroness Orczy. So many people already know that the first major science fiction novel, Frankenstein, was written by a woman. Most people don't know off the top of their head that a woman also wrote the very first superhero novel, and in fact invented the hero genre as we know it. Baroness Orczy shopped her story of a daring hero with a secret identity to 12 different publishers, all of whom refused the manuscript because they said nobody would want to read about some rich guy dressing up in costume and saving people. The last publisher she went to, number 13, considered refusing the manuscript, but instead sent it to his mother to get her opinion, saying, and this is a quote, "She is quite unsophisticated, but knows what she likes." And a couple years later, his mother got back to him and said, "You should publish this book." And so he did. And that is why Baroness Orczy got published. That, along with the fact that when it was in publishing limbo, Orczy had rewritten the story as a stage play and given it to two of her A-list actor friends, Julia Nielsen and Fred Terry. The stage play became so popular that Fred Terry was still playing Sir Percy on stage into his 80s. The couple later bought their own theater and just ran nightly stage performances of this show for years. And after Julia Nielsen stepped down from the lead role, her daughter took over and continued running. So this was a smash hit. Sir Percy Blakeney, who's the protagonist in The Scarlet Pimpernel, was the first modern fictional hero to deliberately maintain two identities. So by day, he was a useless, dim-witted, fashionable society dilettante, and by night he was a heroic master of disguise who would go across to France and rescue condemned prisoners from the guillotine. Basically, he was Bruce Wayne, only this was 34 years before Batman existed. So this was the story that launched the idea of a secret identity and the idea of a hero, especially a fashionable, wealthy hero, who had an alternate life. Obviously, the publisher's mother was right because this franchise became an extremely successful thing. The book sold a lot of copies. The book spawned a ton of sequels and spin-offs. There were, depending on how you count, there are anywhere from 13 to 17 direct sequels. There are many imitators. Even Daffy Duck has had a go at this, so it's a thing. Broadway musical's quite good. So once you had the idea of a secret identity, everyone had to have a heroic character with a secret identity. You had pulps and magazine serials cranking out formula stories as fast as they could print them. And among those imitators, you might recognize some of these few names. This was the launching point of the pulp action hero era, and publishers would introduce literally hundreds of new characters every year. Many of them flopped or were dropped after one or two stories, but some of them, like Zorro or The Shadow or Mandrake the Magician, were adapted for radio or film and are still around. They're still making Zorro films. The Shadow is still getting comic books. These are things that still exist. Early on, a lot of these stories featured thrill-seeking aristocrats siding with the oppressed, much like Robin Hood, and much like the Scarlet Pimpernel because he did it first. But as the genre developed, you started seeing an uptick in anti-hero characters. A lot of times these were also still wealthy playboys because for plot reasons you had to have somebody who had disposable income and didn't actually have to work 12-hour shifts because it doesn't make for a very good story if it's just, well, I'm going to the factory, I'll be back later tonight, and if I'm not too tired, I might do some heroic things. But what they did with them was rather than making them purely, perfectly heroic characters who do no wrong. A lot of times they started becoming vigilantes or borderline criminals, which did something really interesting from the reader's perspective because it simultaneously allowed the reader to vicariously experience the life of an incredibly wealthy adventurer, which is something that most people didn't experience. But by targeting things like organized crime or corrupt public figures and doing little vigilante things on the side, it also reflected that long-standing public opinion we mentioned earlier about the questionable way the rich men in society had earned their money. This was especially critical as society tipped into the Great Depression in the 1930s because readers wanted both escapism and vicarious revenge against the people who had profited at others' expense. So early on, most of your heroes were really clean cut, really good people. As time progressed, they started getting less heroic and more anti-heroic. So, we now have an established mystery genre, we now have an established superhero genre, and we now have the rise of anti-heroes. So these are going to come together. By the turn of the 20th century, the fiction market already proved that it had a substantial taste for crime stories and a lot of these other things, and also that it didn't trust the scruples of the wealthy. And its readers were really prepared to make heroes out of audacious criminals like Adam Worth because that was interesting to read about, and it's very newsworthy when a criminal keeps making fools out of the authorities and escaping with millions of dollars. So the logical progression of all these elements percolating through the public consciousness was the gentleman thief type character. And as this quote indicates, a lot of the most popular characters found their origin in kickback against those Victorian social mores that had been established decades before, and people were starting to chafe against them. This certainly was the period in which the trope reached the peak of its popularity and adopted most of the aesthetic trappings that we still see today. But it's interesting because the ancestor of this character actually started back during the time when Edgar Allan Poe was just releasing his early detective stories. It just didn't grow into its own genre before then. So we're going to jump back in time again, back to 1855. When, I'm sorry, I don't speak French and I'm going to butcher this, Pierre Alexis Ponson de Tourret, I think. I'm sorry to anyone who does speak French. He published a book about an adventurer named Rocambole. Rocambole, which, if you were wondering, is the origin of the word rocambolic. And if you weren't wondering that, now you know that we actually have that word in the English language. It was a word I did not know until I started reading about this character. Anyway, he was a thrill seeker rather than a thief specifically. But he was a well-intentioned adventurer who was often on the wrong side of the law. And I mentioned him in particular because he was one of the major literary inspirations of many of the thief characters to follow closer to the turn of the 20th century, partly because he was introduced by a French author. Many of the most influential literary thieves we're going to look at were produced by French authors, which has a lot to do with what was going on in France during the Belle Epoque. It was similar to what was happening in the US with the industrial expansion, only it was based more in real estate than railroads, and it led to a lot of disillusionment with the status quo. So pop culture in France was also primed to rebel against the rich and embrace an anti-hero on roughly the same timetable that the US was. France didn't go through a civil war at the same time that the US did, so you didn't have the Reconstruction angle, but you had a lot of the same societal situations. In 1859, Wilkie Collins, who, if you remember, was the mystery writer who established all the mystery tropes, he published A Rogue's Life, which was a story about an unscrupulous fortune hunter. Jumping forward half a century or so, which I know is skipping a lot of books, but we got a lot of material to get through, so we're just touching on some highlights here. In 1897, you had Grant Allen's Colonel Clay, who was a con man who targeted unscrupulous people for his cons. So in many ways, he's the spiritual ancestor of protagonists like The Rogues, Hustle, Leverage, all those TV shows about con artists who go after, other criminals, basically. And in that same year, Simon Carne, who was a con artist who doubled as a detective, was introduced. So this is kind of the marriage of the rogue genre and the detective genre. But neither of these characters are really true gentleman thieves in the sense that we tend to think of. The first of those, the first true gentleman thief to strike it big in fiction, was actually a deliberate inversion of Sherlock Holmes, written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's brother-in-law, and that was Raffles. E.W. Hornung was married to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's sister. The first Raffles stories showed up about a decade after Sherlock Holmes. The first volume of the collected stories is actually dedicated to Arthur Conan Doyle, who, by all accounts, was not amused by this. And there are definite similarities between the characters. Raffles has a partner in crime named Bunny Manders, who is basically Watson. Like Holmes, Raffles dies at one point and later comes back in disguise. Ultimately, he went to work against the enemies in World War One, just as Holmes did. There are a lot of similarities, and it was this exact same formula, except instead of being the detective who solves crimes, Raffles is the criminal who does the crimes. And he is the archetype. He is the grandfather of all gentleman thief characters, and is frequently copied and referenced by other writers. He's also very distinctly English, which puts him in interesting company for a number of reasons. Um, and while he was directly inspired by Sherlock Holmes, Raffles in turn inspired multiple generations of elegant yet shady characters, as this quote says. And you can remember some of these names. We are going to especially focus on Leslie Charteris and the Saint later on. Raffles is also partly responsible for popularizing that classic image of the gentleman thief dressed in evening wear, cape, top hat, cane, mask, and with the mask. Not that the mask is normal evening wear, but in this case it was a masquerade style mask. You can see that on this book cover. The reason he's dressed that way in the context of the story is because he's on his way to the dinner party. But that image of a well-dressed gentleman committing a crime definitely stuck in the public consciousness, and it became a really iconic image of this very well-dressed, well-to-do appearing gentleman going off and sneaking into places and stealing jewelry or whatever. Raffles first appeared in a short story called The Ides of March, which introduces him as a sympathetic character who commits a crime specifically to help a friend in need. Bunny is in debt. Bunny has no way out. Raffles says, "I will get you out," and then commits a crime to get money for him. That story became the basis of several of the films and plays based on this character, and also got copied a lot. And I'm showing this particular illustration because you were about to see this very scene in motion in a 1917 film called Raffles the Amateur Cracksman. Like Sherlock Holmes, Raffles also achieved very considerable success on stage and in early film, in silent film. This particular film is one of 9 silent Raffles productions. There were also 5 talkies, the first of which starred Ronald Colman, and a popular British TV series in the 70s, which is also quite good. And normally I would show you clips of it, but I can't. But you can look it up. Your public library probably has it. This film was, as I said, produced in 1917. It stars the legendary John Barrymore as Raffles. He's the one on the right, and Frank Morgan on the left as Bunny Manders. Frank Morgan had a very successful silent film career before talkies came in, but you have probably seen him most often as the Wizard of Oz. Random trivia for you. He is the man behind the curtain. So in this scene, what's going on is Bunny discovers that his close friend Raffles is actually the infamous thief known as the Amateur Cracksman, and he has stolen a valuable necklace in order to win a bet to get money to help Bunny pay off his debt. I think I've turned the sound down fairly low. The soundtrack is not original to this movie. It was whatever somebody slapped on that was royalty free over this file. In this film, I am going to show the clip because it is in the public domain, being pre-1923. So as you can see from that, it's very much couched as he's an adventurer. In the books themselves, Raffles is perpetually broke, and he actually does need the money he steals because he is a professional cricketer, but that doesn't mean he actually gets paid because he doesn't get paid, but he's expected to appear at all of these society functions. So he has a very high cost of living and no income. But in this film in particular, they just set it up as he's just helping people. He's not in it for himself. Um, we're going to skip the 1977 one, which is a really great show, but it's copyrighted, so you can watch that on your own. Just a few years after Raffles, in France, another gentleman thief made his historic debut. This was Maurice Leblanc's Arsène Lupin, who is arguably the single most famous thief in all of modern literature, and is certainly the most imitated. Raffles established the genre, and Lupin made it super famous. Lupin was a gentleman burglar who stole things and liked to gloat about it, but he would draw the line at killing. So he was not a violent criminal. He just liked stealing things. Much like Robin Hood and Rocambole and several other characters, he frequently targeted villainous characters for his robberies or committed crimes to help those in need rather than for personal gain. He was a master of disguise, and in one famous story, he warned his target before he robbed them, allowing him to gain access to the house in the guise of a guard hired to protect the valuables. So he would use the warnings or advance notices to manipulate his victims. When it suited his purpose, he occasionally even turned detective and helped the police solve cases, but more often than not, he used those as an opportunity to snag some treasure on the way to solving the case or after solving the case. So he was not entirely altruistic. Lupin's image, especially in film, is one of elegance. He frequently posed as a member of the nobility to gain the confidence of his targets, so he dressed very well, he traveled for first class, and a lot of the classic gentleman thief persona is drawn from that image of him as a potential, member of the nobility. He was not. His backstory is actually given in a later book. He was not a member of the upper class, but he frequently pretended to be part of the upper class because it allowed him to get close to the people he was going to steal from. These stories have been translated into many different languages around the globe. There are a lot of films, a lot of television shows. Uh, just it's astounding the amount of influence that Lupin as a character has. Uh, Lupin is as popular in French-speaking cultures as Sherlock Holmes is in English-speaking cultures. And in fact, Leblanc wrote stories in which the two characters faced off, though he had to change the detective's name after he was contacted by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's solicitors, because he didn't have permission to use the character. So instead, Lupin had to match wits against Herlock Sholmes, a totally original character who has no resemblance to anybody else. So, this character did meet up with other famous detectives. We will get to Akechi Kogoro in the second half of this presentation when we turn to Japan. We will get there. So, as you can tell by this quote, which I am not going to read for you because I'm sure you can all read because you're all smart people, this is the character who personified that instinct of rebelling against social conformity and rebelling against the rules that have been put in place by people more powerful than you. This video I can't show you, but it is John Barrymore playing Lupin instead of Raffles. He played both of them, I think multiple times. Lupin also enjoyed considerable success on stage and in cinema, like the other characters did, not only in France, but in England and America as well. There were a bunch of Lupin films made during the first half of the 20th century, and one of Lupin's tricks, which is what's going on in this scene, which I can't show you, it was to manipulate his targets using advance notices. So this is a technique that only showed up, I think, once in the original stories, but has become one of the most imitated attributes of the Phantom Thief, especially in Japan. Pretty much in all the Japanese versions we're going to look at, the characters in question give notice or warn their victims before they steal from them. And then frequently they brag about it afterwards because they're doing it for the glory and not for profit.
Well,
Lupin is, as I said, one of the most imitated thief characters. Everybody's had a go at the character, including a Disney villain in the Scrooge McDuck comics. Um, there's no conclusive paper trail, but it's pretty obvious that David Niven's character in the Pink Panther film, the original Pink Panther film, was directly inspired by Lupin because there was a 1908 stage play based on Lupin that included a bumbling French police inspector, very much like Inspector Clouseau, and you can draw the lines there. There are more than 20 films and television series about Lupin in just in the 20th century, and they're still making them. Some of them, a lot of them were in French-speaking countries, but some of them were in America and Britain as well. Um, and as is the case with most fictional characters, over time the image of Lupin became more diluted and farther removed from the source material. And there was a spin-off in the 1960s that I watched it because I was doing research for this panel several years ago, and I cannot even tell you what the title of the film was, but it featured like two illegitimate sons of Lupin fighting over which one of them was worthy of their father's name, which actually sounds way more interesting than the film was, because the only thing I remember about it is like driving around. One of them was driving around the city with a girl in his car and talking for like 20 minutes. I don't know. It was utterly forgettable, but many spin-offs. People will slap the names on anything. In 2004, the picture that's on the right here, there was a big budget action film titled The Adventures of Arsène Lupin, which was a reboot of the character with a somewhat sexier origin story. I mean that literally. It's a French film. And it had sort of weird borderline supernatural elements, and I'm pretty sure it was nothing that Maurice Leblanc ever imagined for his stories. But, the character has become bigger than the original stories now. And of course, there's the new Netflix series, which, if you have not seen, it is not a direct adaptation of the books, but it does tie in. No spoilers. In the 1990s, there was a very stylized, very cool to look at cartoon that was, I believe, French-Canadian production. It was originally called The Adventures of Arsène Lupin, and then when they translated it into English, apparently they decided that American children wouldn't know who that was, so they called it Knighthood. The character's name is still Arsène Lupin. He still signs his notes A.L., but he's called Knighthood in the dub. I don't know why. Anyway, you can look that up on YouTube because I can't show it. So, also in France, but a little bit later, this is 1911 now, another hugely influential criminal/thief character was introduced in Alain and Sylvestre's Fantômas. Fantômas is not a gentleman by any stretch of the imagination. The stories were a lot darker, tending toward the macabre, and he was a master of disguise, which during that era had really become a staple of detective fiction, much more than it is now. Now we look at it and it's like, oh, well, masters of disguise, it's a little bit hokey, it's a little bit unbelievable. Back then, everybody had to be a master of disguise. The criminals, the detectives, everybody. And Fantômas he was also a murderer. He was not a nice guy. He's not somebody to emulate. So he was a thief. He was a murderer. He would often disguise himself as his victims or frame other people for his crimes. In one story, he even frames his own son for murder. Not a really nice guy. But as you can see from this cover, even though he doesn't subscribe to the same sort of code of honor or the other similar things from the Phantom Thief archetype, the way the more Robin Hood style criminals do, he's still visually depicted the same way because it was an iconic thing that they could tie into some of that same market. People who were already used to Raffles and Lupin could look at Fantômas and instantly recognize what sort of story it was, even though it was much, much darker. And to that point, instead of holding a cane like Raffles or Lupin might be, he's holding a bloody dagger, as you do. All of the popular thief characters in this era tended to use the same aesthetic, even if it didn't show up in the stories that way. If you look at some of the pulp magazines and things, they will still have illustrations. I have a early 1930s magazine serial chapter of one of the Saint stories, and it has Simon Templar, who we will talk about in a few minutes, wearing a top hat and white tie, which is something I don't think Simon ever wore in any of the literally hundreds of stories that he appeared in. I don't think I ever, remember him being depicted in evening dress, but for the illustrations in that magazine serial, because they wanted to depict the character a certain way to tie into the expectations for that character, they still use the same artistic style. It's much the same thing as superheroes in, the second half of the 20th century. All comic book superheroes wore spandex up to a point. So back to Fantômas, who did not wear spandex, as far as we know. One of the things that contributed to the iconic status of Fantômas in particular was they had this famously lurid cover art by Gino Storace, which was actually really highly regarded by the Surrealist movement, and a lot of the Surrealist artists in that era, people like René Magritte, who is a very famous artist, produced works relating to or inspired by Fantômas. But this all of this looks very pulpy. You've got blood splatter everywhere. You've got people creeping out from under beds and disembodied hands and all of this stuff. A lot of the cover art's really shocking. So here is the other clip that I can actually show you, because this is from 1913 and it is not in copyright. Fantômas was also successful in movie adaptations, just like the other characters. There were a series of silent films, this is one of them here, which were highly influential in European cinema, and many European directors all the way up through the 1960s credited this particular film series as having influenced their work because of the stylism and just the way that it was done. What you're going to see here is a credit clip, this is back in the day when the openings of films were treated like stage plays. So you would list the players and the character they were going to play, just like it was the playbill. And in this case, they would give the name of the actor, give the name of the character, and then show a clip so you could recognize that character on screen. Now, because Fantômas is a master of disguise, they actually show him in many of his different disguises, which is why I've included this clip so you can see kind of what the character was known for. The English title of this film is Fantômas in the Shadow of the Guillotine, and last I checked, I think it's available on Netflix for streaming. This is the restored version, which they did a whole restoration of a bunch of the Fantômas films about 5 years ago. But it looks pretty good for having been done over a century ago. The prints have actually survived. So Fantômas, I could do an entire 2-hour talk just on the influence of Fantômas in pop culture, but I can't because I don't have that much time. Even with removing the videos from this presentation, I don't have that much time. So I'll give you the real quick version. Fantômas influenced a lot more than just cinema and art. There were a ton of comic book imitators. There were a ton of comic book copycats. There were all sorts of... There were live action films. There's a Beastie Boys song about him. Like, there's everything. All sorts of things. But all of this can be traced back to the pop... Whoops. Sorry, I just hit the wrong button. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Here we go. All of this is traced back to the same general genre that was started by Raffles and Lupin. It's your principal character who's your protagonist, if not a character you particularly like or are rooting for, at least the one it's focusing on, is a thief or criminal. And yeah, I could spend a lot more time on this than I actually have. And if you ever want to contact me later for the rundown, I can explain how, like, Marvel based a comic book on a ripoff that an actor was in because of there's a whole bunny trail we can go on there. So, anyway, Fantômas, important. Anyway, let's move on. In 1914, Frank L. Packard began publishing stories about a character named Jimmy Dale, who was an anti-hero cracksman with not just one but multiple criminal identities. And he had a female partner who herself was a master of disguise, and basically he was a thrill seeker who would break into people's safes for fun and leave a calling card just to show that he could, and then he started getting blackmailed by somebody and had to start doing other things. And it was an interesting premise for the story, and I'm actually kind of amazed that it hasn't been reinterpreted more often. It was made into a movie, and I think I want to say somebody revived the character in the early 2000s for maybe a one-off, like a comic or something. But this was, at the time, a popular rival to Raffles for, the popular American thief. Because Raffles was in the 1890s, so had been around for a while, but by 1914, Raffles was the previous generation. We were looking for new things. So you start seeing a whole bunch of these gentleman thieves burst on the scene as a follow-up. So this is right in the prime era of the pulp novel development, and you're churning out a whole bunch of these anti-hero characters, and you're going to see a bunch of these all came out about the same time. In the same year, the Lone Wolf was a English gentleman and reformed jewel thief who would solve crimes. So he started as a thief and then decided to become a detective. There was a long list of films. There was a 1950s TV series starring Louis Hayward. Louis Hayward was also the first actor to play the Saint on film. We'll get to him in a moment. And then a little bit later, Earl Stanley Gardner, who is best known for creating Perry Mason. Perry Mason was a lawyer who had a popular TV series and movies. But he was a pulp writer for decades. He actually created 49 different series characters, of which one was the Patent Leather Kid. And that was his gentleman thief character. So he was an elegant, rich guy who occasionally also doubled as a criminal and pretty much was just an adventurer like the others. Didn't need the money. Then in a couple years later, you have the Baron, who's yet another jewel thief turned detective who helps the police, and this was a very long-running series. There were 38 novels written between 1937 and 1979. There was a 1966 TV series that, interestingly, a whole bunch of the TV series based on this style of character were all developed within the same couple of years and shared writers. So one of the writers for the Baron TV series was well-known British television scriptwriter Terry Nation, who at the time was also writing scripts for things like The Saint and The Avengers and a bunch of other shows. He also is best known, possibly now to modern audiences, as the creator of some British pepper pots who roll around saying "exterminate." So if you ever watch Doctor Who, you will see the name of Terry Nation in any credits or any episode that has the Daleks in it. And that's what he's remembered for, despite the fact that he wrote for many of the most popular TV shows all through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's funny how things turn out. Okay, so we have to talk about the Saint. It's impossible to have this presentation or this conversation without him. And I will warn you, I am a bit of a Saint nerd. I collect Saint stuff, so that's how I got on this topic in the first place. But I will not spend the entire remainder of the panel time talking about him, even though I could. So the Saint is the nickname of fictional adventurer Simon Templar. Saint was because his initials were ST, which sounds like saint. As indicated by these quotes, he is one of the biggest players in the thief slash antihero slash criminal protagonist genre. In terms of literary influence, he's only slightly behind Arsène Lupin and is actually a much bigger commercial success. The Saint is one of, if not the, single most prolific fictional characters of the 20th century in any genre. That's really hard to wrap your brain around, but more works were published about this character during the 20th century than literally any other character, period. In terms of the number of works produced, the Saint property is definitely the single largest franchise in all of contemporary detective fiction. That is contemporary, that is not all of detective fiction ever, because I don't think he's beat Sherlock Holmes yet, but there's still a lot of it. So going back to the beginning, the Saint was introduced in 1928, so right around the time that a lot of these other heroes are kicking off and hitting their stride. Leslie Charteris wrote what was originally just like a one-shot novel called Meet the Tiger, and Simon Templar was the name of the main character. But the character sold, and Charteris began writing sequels, and history was made. So the Saint is as much vigilante as thief. He actually does a lot of other stuff that's not thieving. He's more of an adventurer. And he absolutely profits to an extent from his crimes, but he only targets criminals who are actively causing harm to people. So he doesn't just go out and rob people. He doesn't go out and punch people. He robs and punches people who are hurting other people. So he definitely has some altruism there. He will always help the oppressed or the victimized, regardless of whether or not there's any profit for him in it. And while he doesn't exactly fit the Phantom Thief mold aesthetically, you're never going to see him in a cape, you're running around in costume, and rarely in a top hat, except for that one 1930s magazine illustration I have. But he definitely ticks the boxes of, charming anti-hero, the personal code of honor, the taunting the police as much as possible, that sort of thing. And he does also leave warnings and notes for his targets. He has a signature, which is the stick figure with the halo that you're seeing on the cover here. And so he will write a note to warn somebody that they're on his list, or warn that he's going to do something, or, something along that line, and just sign it with that stick figure. Anything he gets from his crimes, he turns over to charity, minus a 10% finder's fee. And occasionally, he even does some of his work on the right side of the law. That was especially true during World War II. Like every single fictional character out there, he was briefly converted into a secret agent to help the Allies during the war. You know how that goes. Even Sherlock Holmes had that happen to him in the Basil Rathbone movies. Sherlock Holmes, a Victorian character, got ported to World War II specifically to fight the Nazis because everybody did in the 1940s. Um, Now, the Saint is by no means a totally clean-cut hero. Like, if you're a bad guy who gets in his way, he will just shoot you or drop your body in a vat of molten metal or something along those lines. But the best thing about this character, and I think what accounts for the staying power, is that he is the wisecracking, snarky guy who will shoot you but also make fun of you at the same time. And he breaks the fourth wall. He makes commentary about current events or his author or the reader or politics or whatever other target the author felt like addressing at that moment. Really, the writing style of these books owes a lot to P.G. Wodehouse, and in fact, one of the early Saint books is dedicated to P.G. Wodehouse because Leslie Charteris was a big Wodehouse fan, which I think is why that connection is there. Um, and as I said, this is literally one of the most popular characters in the world in the 20th century, and there are more works than this that I could not fit on the slide. I have found more since I made this slide, and could not find a way to fit them in. So there's a lot of Saint content. There's a lot. Um, and something else that accounts for this character's staying power and influence over other things is that the character is always portrayed as contemporary. So even though the books were produced over a span of 50 years, or maybe because of that, the character was always written in the present day. So if you read a Saint novel from the 1920s, it reads like a character in the 1920s. And if you read a Saint novel from the 1960s, they're driving 1960s cars and dealing with 1960s technology. And if you read a Saint novel from World War II, they're talking about stuff during the war. So it's always written as present day, unlike Sherlock Holmes, who is very closely tied to the Victorian gas lamp aesthetic, or Raffles or Lupin, who are always Edwardian in appearance, where you've got the top hat and the cape and everything. The Saint is automatically updated for a modern audience every time a new installment is released. And as you can see from these pictures, the fashions change, the cars change. The car is actually something really worth mentioning here. The Saint was one of the first fictional characters to have a signature sports car. So the exact make and model varied by era. In the books it was a Hirondelle. In the Roger Moore TV series it was a Volvo P1800S. In the Ian Ogilvy series it was a Jaguar, I think Jaguar XJS, and then Andrew Clark had a Lamborghini, and Simon Dutton had a Jensen Interceptor, and they have all different cars depending on what marketing deals they could get at the time. But the reason that James Bond drove Bentleys for decades, and now whatever, I mean it changes depending on what Bond film it is. James Bond, the films and the adaptations that have been made owe a lot to the Saint interpretation, and the signature sports car, which we can actually credit Roger Moore for the Volvo, because it was his car, is the reason you have car marketing tie-ins in TV shows now, because the Saint was the first character to have that, and the first TV series to do that. So the car branding has been around for over 90 years now in the Saint series. Um, and, the Saint's been played by a lot of really famous actors: Louis Hayward, Ian Ogilvy, Simon Dutton, a bunch of others. I will give you this caveat because it's on the screen. Do not watch the Val Kilmer movie. It is not a real Saint film. It is fake. It is awful. It is a dreadful film. I don't normally just come out and say, no, just avoid this, but save yourself some pain and don't sit through that movie. Sir Roger Moore, who is on screen as the Saint, is best known for being the longest running James Bond in history. The reason he was cast as Bond is because he had just come off of 7 years of playing the Saint on television, and they knew he could do that sort of character. And up until his death in 2017, he was still very much involved with the Saint community. He was the president of the Saint fan club. His son produced one of the pilot treatments for a new Saint TV series. So he was a big part of that as well. But anyway, I'm not going to spend the entire time talking about the Saint or giving you trivia, because That's not the point of this, but I do want to mention how influential this is because outside of Asian countries, and we're going to do a whole big thing on Japan in a few minutes, but outside of that, this is probably the most influential character of this archetype from the past 100 years. You know, you have Raffles and Lupin at the very beginning, and Lupin is certainly still influential, but it's mostly the Lupin readaptations, readaptations, readaptations. The Saint was actually new media coming out consistently, and through much of Europe and the United States and lots of places, you're going to see a lot of that imitation. I'm not going to show you this video because it's copyrighted. Moving on. Really quickly, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the what I call archetype adjacent thieves in pop culture. And this is a lot of characters who are inspired by certain elements of the gentleman thief archetype, especially the element of doing the wrong things for the right reasons, but they may or may not come across as a true phantom thief type because they don't necessarily have the wardrobe or the other, the other elements that we associate with phantom thieves. So these are more of your chaotic neutral anti-hero type characters, but because of their complexity and because we like rascals, they still hold some of the same fascination for audiences. So, you have characters in literature who are right up front. The title, or the series title, The Gentlemen Bastards, it's in there. You've got that idea. You've got characters who are criminals, but they're still our protagonists. Hustle and Leverage are basically the same show, only Hustle has better accents. So if you're a Leverage fan, I recommend you check out Hustle. It came first. It's also British. And, there were a lot of things going on. So that's what was happening in the Western Hemisphere during the second half of the 19th and most of the 20th century. However, the Western Hemisphere is only half the planet, and there's, a lot of other planets to talk about. So now it's time to meet this guy. Hirai Taro was a scholar and translator and author who was active in Japan primarily during the first half of the 20th century. He was born right before the turn of the century. He was a fan of Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is an American writer, but his works were exported all over the world. And as a fan of Poe, Hirai Taro published his own works under the pen name Edogawa Ranpo, which is a very rough approximation of the transliteration of Edgar Allan Poe. He did that as an homage to Poe because he was a big Poe fan. And much like his namesake, he is primarily known for writing horror stories, or eroguro, which are sort of unsettling, erotic grotesque work. He also, though, wrote a lot of mysteries, and he also wrote nonfiction commentary, and he also created the fictional detective who is considered the Sherlock Holmes of Japan, which I'll get to in just a second. So Edogawa was also, Hirai Taro slash Edogawa Ranpo was also a fan of Sherlock Holmes. He translated some of Conan Doyle's works into Japanese, and he also really liked Maurice Leblanc, who was the creator of Arsène Lupin. He didn't speak English, but he could read and write it, so he would translate written works, even though he didn't communicate with other English speakers. Because these works, most of these books were not readily available in Japan up until the 70s or 80s. A lot of these mystery stories they were hugely influential to Japanese writers who could acquire them, but they weren't really commonly available until after the middle of the 20th century for a variety of reasons, mostly political, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So during the 1920s, Edogawa wrote several pieces of detective fiction featuring a detective named Akechi Kogoro, who is the Sherlock Holmes of Japan, as I said, not necessarily because he's particularly similar to that character, but more that he was one of the first widely known fictional detectives in Japan, and in the 1920s, you didn't have a lot of detective fiction going on in Japan. That was not a genre that was well established yet. And Edogawa had obviously been heavily influenced by Poe and Conan Doyle and other Western mystery writers. Interestingly, in a sort of bizarre life-imitating art twist, Edogawa's fiction was linked to several real-life crimes committed by copycat criminals during the 1920s. And when the authorities arrested these people, they found Edogawa Ranpo paperbacks shoved in their pockets, and they at one point in, I think it was 1938, it was immediately before the Second World War, when the Japanese government was really cracking down on things. And after several of these crimes had happened, they basically went to Edogawa Ranpo and said, "You need to unpublish your work. you need to stop distributing this. It's bad for public morale. And so he was in the quandary of, well, this is my livelihood. Do I stop making money, or do I obey the government that wants me to not write books? So it got really complicated. All that to say, this is not the sort of writer that you would expect to be the first choice to provide content for a children's magazine, but that's exactly what happened. In 1935, Edogawa was approached by the editors of the boys' magazine Shonen Club with an offer to write a serial. And at this point in history, children's fiction in Japan was intended to promote wholesome and patriotic interests. This is when you had a very heavy rising nationalism interest in Japan. I mean, this is right before the outbreak of World War II, so that should give you an idea of what was going on. You were past the first wave of, wow, the Western world is really interesting because we've just reopened to trade for the first time in 200 years, and now you're in the third generation that came after the Restoration in 1868. So you're seeing that kickback against all of that openness, and a lot of trying to exterminate a lot of Western influences, trying to enforce patriotism and that sort of thing. Was what the government was really working on. And there were very strict regulations on what children's fiction was allowed to include. So children's fiction was supposed to be like wholesome and patriotic and uplifting, but wholesome things are frequently boring in kids fiction. Like, nobody wants to read stories where everybody's just like, things are good all the time. So the challenge for this was to make it both positive and within government guidelines, and still interesting. So Edogawa's solution to this conundrum was to combine a fascinating villain with an active child protagonist. So he modeled this villain, who was Nijumenso, or 20 Faces, directly on Arsène Lupin. He's a very, dramatic master of disguise, a thief, a criminal, and originally his plan was to make him the hero, but the government said no. They would not have a thief as a hero, so he made him the criminal and made a kid the hero instead. And he actually he liked Maurice Leblanc's work so much that the first Nijumenso story actually just lifts a couple of chapters almost verbatim from a couple of Lupin stories. So he has him sending the notice to his victim and manipulating him exactly as Lupin did in that story. But, Leblanc's works were not widely available in Japan at this time, so the odds were good that Edogawa's readers, who were primarily well-to-do preteen boys who couldn't read English, they wouldn't notice that they were reading something that had already been done by Maurice Leblanc. So for his protagonist, Edogawa created Kobayashi, who's a 10-year-old assistant to Detective Akechi Kogoro. So the established detective character that he'd been writing about for 15 years at this point, he just has, he actually has a 10-year-old sidekick who's the hero of this story. And Akechi Kogoro is conveniently out of town during all the legwork of the investigation, so the kid gets to do all those things, but he returns just in time to keep his child sidekick from facing any true peril that might discourage the bright young readers of the magazine, and that also might, keep him from violating any mandates about what dangers children could experience in stories. The guidelines for fiction were really, really difficult to work around. And Kobayashi, in turn, heads up the Shonen Tanteidan, the boy detectives, who are a group of clever children who help the detective solve mysteries. They're kind of like Boy Scouts, except they have detective badges and mystery toolkits and guns. Yeah, they're 10-year-olds with guns. It's weird. And the boy detectives are in much the same vein as Sherlock Holmes' Baker Street Irregulars, where they run around and find out things and follow people and that sort of thing. And he also may have been influenced by Maurice Leblanc's 1909 novel, The Hollow Needle, which is a Lupin adventure in which Lupin is troubled by a child detective who keeps figuring out his tricks. So definitely taking some notes from his favorite authors there. Now, as I said, this was shortly before World War II, so the Japanese government, which was already looking toward the possibility of war and was very deliberately grooming the younger generation for civil service, in 1937, the Ministry of Home Affairs in Japan implemented new guidelines concerning children's literature that severely limited what could be depicted in stories. So, stories intended for children were not allowed to feature any elements that could be considered subversive, anti military, or bad for morale. Which, okay, on the face of it, all right, don't write subversive stories for children. You can almost see that. And then you see that it actually includes not only content like gruesome imagery or criminal actions or that sort of thing, which, okay, legit, if you're writing for 10-year-olds, but also includes things like tragedy, love stories, danger, any depiction of crime. Like they were really stringent guidelines. And so Edgar Allan Poe had actually wanted to make Nijumenso the protagonist, like Lupin and Raffles, but wasn't allowed to, and he wanted to title the story Kaito Nijumenso, as a reference to Kaito Lupin, which is what Arsène Lupin was known as in Japan, which is like mysterious thief is how that would roughly translate, or the modern translation is phantom thief. But basically, it's an unusual or a strange or a mysterious thief, but the government came back and said, you are not allowed to use the character to, because to and thief, if a child sees that word thief in the title, it might be bad for morale somehow, so you have to change it. So every other Phantom Thief or Gentleman Thief character in Japan is called a kaito. Nijumenso, who was the very first one, is Kaijin Nijumenso, or, fiend or strange person is how that's usually translated. And it's not that he's not a kaito, it's that that's the original title of the original story was Kaijin Nijumenso because they could not use the word to, which is kind of bizarre. So yeah, as time went on, politics got messier. The war got closer. Japanese censorship grew so stringent that by the third book in the series, because this was a series that went on for many years, the Nijumetsu series that Edgar Allan Poe was writing for the magazines. But by the third book in the series, he was no longer permitted to depict any criminal activity in his stories. These are detective stories, and he was not allowed to show any criminal activity. So, I'm not quite sure how you approach that as a writer. I think I would change careers at that point. But he went on and he wrote like 24 books or something in the series. So yeah, it worked. Um, so Kaiji Nijumenso went on to be a massive success and spawned more than 2 dozen sequels. So, unfortunately for American fans, only 2 of these books have been translated into English, and only the first book in the series is actually currently available commercially in the US. So, it didn't come out until a few years ago. I think I pre-ordered it when they announced that it was going to be translated, and that was the first time I'd ever been able to get my hands on an actual paperback of one of these books. And the other one, there's a later book in the series has been translated into English in Japan. It's like one of those books that you read to practice English, but I don't think it's commercially available in the US. I will have to check and see, because I haven't checked in the last year or two. I'll have to check and see if they've added any more to their translation list. But in any case, you can get the first one, and it's a fun little read. It's definitely a children's story, and it's very similar to some of the Lupin stories, but hey, it's worth it. So Nijumenso became nearly as prolific a character as Lupin, on which he was based, leading to many film and manga and anime interpretations. Unlike Lupin, he didn't have as much competition from other iconic thief characters, like there was no Raffles, there was no Fantômas, so he had a pretty solid corner on the genre in the first half of the 20th century. In the second half of the 20th century, copycat characters became ridiculously popular, especially in anime and manga. During the 80s and 90s, which is, the era in which I personally was getting into anime and manga, nearly every series I watched had some random Phantom Thief character show up. They were everywhere. They were just really, really popular. Uh, Many commercial variants of Nijimenso, especially in those adaptations, were not authorized by Edogawa's estate. So that was something. I mean, it was something that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Maurice LeBlanc's estates had also gone through because Sherlock Holmes was a trademarked character and people kept trying to use that character. And to this day, you will see distinctions between, you know, versions of 20 Faces that are authorized and versions of 20 Faces that are just very similar with the serial numbers slightly smudged. So, a couple of the shows we're going to mention later are actually authorized, and I will point those out as we go by. The Shonen Tanteidan, which is the boy detectives, the group that assists assists Akechi Kogoro, went on to have its own separate cultural phenomenon. So basically, the idea of a bunch of spunky kids running around fighting crime is not really a new one, but it worked really well in Japan because in the era when this happened, reduced real estate in cities, limited access to the outside world, and a crackdown on leisure time. So during the 1930s and 1940s, children were expected to be indoors studying, not outdoors playing. So you had a really high demand for these vicarious adventures where, these kids are just running around without adult supervision having adventures. Um, and as the time went on and the cities got more crowded and kids spent less and less time outside, it really became popular all through the 20th century. And the boy detectives featured in radio dramas and television and film as early as the 1950s, actually. And then there was a whole string of movies and television shows. In the 70s, there was a TV series called BD7, which is what you're looking at right now. This show was very special. It pitted the boy detectives against not only hardened criminals like 20 Faces, who, as you can see, is shown here wearing a purple satin ruffled tuxedo shirt and a 1970s mustache, because that's a thing. It was the 70s. But also they faced off against spandex-clad men in flying saucers. Like, there was some weird stuff in this show. It was a typical 70s over-the-top ridiculous live-action kids show. But of course, there was also a flood of associated merchandise, including boy detectives' badges and notebooks. Now, I do not have this from any third source. This is purely my own inference, so do not take it as fact. But this was the 1970s. And during the 1970s, there was a generation of children growing up who would go on to become creators of anime and manga in the 80s and 90s. One of whom was Aoyama Gosho, the creator of Detective Conan. And if anybody has seen Detective Conan, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, there is a Shonen Tanteidan in Detective Conan who also has boy detectives badges and notebooks and all this branded merchandise. And I strongly suspect that Aoyama Gosho grew up watching this show. Nobody has ever proven that. I'm just guessing based on the dates. But in any case, so that the other reason I think that is the BD7 series has a version of Akechi Kogoro that is not really honoring the legacy of the character recognized as the Sherlock Holmes of Japan. He is sort of a terrible, bumbling failure of a detective, which Akechi Kogoro in BD7 and Mori Kogoro in Detective Conan, who is specifically named for him, there's some similarity there as well. So, we'll talk about Conan in just a minute. I can't show you this clip, but I will talk about it actually. So, like many other characters, especially pulp heroes whose original stories have fallen into public domain, you see this with Zorro and the Scarlet Pimpernel and a lot of the other early pulps. A lot of modern authors have taken liberties with these characters, and the same thing happened with 20 Faces, where there was a book a few years ago. Kitamura So was the author. Actually, there were two books, two revisionist novels based on the idea of Nijimenso. One of them was made into a film in 2008. I once read a review of this film that said K20 has as much in common with the original as Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes does with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories. Now, I have seen the movie and read the book, and I have to tell you that is not an accurate statement, because Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes was still recognizable as Sherlock Holmes. It is much more appropriate to compare this film to that Asylum Sherlock Holmes movie that had, like, Sherlock Holmes fighting animatronic dinosaurs in downtown London, because it has no resemblance whatsoever to the original. But it does a good job of epitomizing what the character of Nijimenso and the Kaito archetype have become in modern Japanese entertainment, which is really much more about showy magic tricks and flashy escapes and spectacle than about the actual crime being committed. And I will tell you that I paid money for this movie and I kind of regret that decision, but it does have a really good opening scene, which is what this is. So if you get a chance to watch it for free from the library or something, I think it's available in some streaming services. It's worth watching the first 10 minutes of the film. So, moving on. Now, moving on to anime and manga, actually. There are literally hundreds of examples I could pull out from anime, so I'm just going to hit a few highlights here. I know there are other series that I will not have time to get to. I've seen a lot of them. I've picked out just the ones I think are relevant here. So there are several series that are either reboots or direct sequels to original literary sources, and by that I mean Nijimenso, Arsène Lupin, and specific characters who fit the Phantom Thief archetype. One of the direct follow-ups to Nijimenso's story is Nijimenso no Musume, or Daughter of 20 Faces. It started as a manga in 2002, and it's a spin-off series, basically, about a girl who is adopted by 20 Faces, and then when he disappears, she forms her own all-female version of the Shonen Tanteidan. Which should be the Shoujo Tanteidan, but they kept the name because it was original. So unlike most of the other series which just borrow from the original without credit, this series was actually authorized by the estate of Edgar Allan Poe, which makes it kind of unique because that doesn't happen very often. It should be noted that Nijimenso in this series, he's still a very mysterious and enigmatic character in this series, but it's definitely a much more noble and heroic figure than he was in the original. Primarily because he's the main character's adoptive father, and they probably didn't want to make him a creep. But this is a clip I can't show you for copyright reasons, but it's an interesting adaptation of Nijimenso. That you do get to see Nijimenso in action and committing some of his crimes, and it is very definitely in the vein of the original works. One step farther away from the original is Nijimenso Neonagai, which is a companion to the Clamp School Detective series, which itself owes its inspiration to the Boy Detectives books because, honestly, that's what it is. So the protagonist in this series, Akira, is the 9-year-old son of the original 20 Faces. It's best not to ask any questions about that because he's got a really complicated family. He also has multiple mothers. It's really weird. You need a family tree for this. Anyway, Akira is also one of the 3 elementary school detectives who feature in Clamp School Detectives, which, Clamp being what it is, if you're not familiar with Clamp, Clamp is a group of mangaka who write really pretty and really elaborate and complex manga, and then they write massive crossovers for all of them. So the Clamp School, there's several different series set in Clamp School, and Clamp School also features into X and into Tsubasa and into several other series. It's also the Ultimate Side of the Apocalypse in one series, but that's a separate issue. So the English language titles for this series, when it was released in the US, varied dramatically because several different companies acquired several different Clamp properties at the same time and released different versions of it. So the manga and the 2 or 3 anime version releases, and it's been translated as The Man of Many Faces, The Thief with 20 Faces, The Man of 20 Masks. There are a bunch of different titles for it, none of which are actually the original title. So it is a cutesy 9-year-old version of Nijimenso is the closest I can come up with for this. And it also crosses over with Clamp School Detectives, Deucalion Campus Defenders, X1999, Tsubasa Reservoir Chronicle, and anything else that ever touched on Clamp School. There is also an anime based on Clamp School Detectives, Clamp Gakuen Tanteidan, which was made into an anime several years after the previous manga, and also features Nijimenso, and also features an imposter of Nijimenso, who is more like Nijimenso than the actual Nijimenso in this series, which I could show you a clip of, but not at this event. So it is worth noting that but this was in the 90s. The previous series was I think late 80s is when the manga started. At this point in anime and manga tropiness, for lack of a better term, a lot of the Phantom Thief characteristics had been boiled down to things like playing cards, magic imagery, announcing a crime by distributing flyers or by calling the newspapers, and things like that tended to be really ubiquitous during the 80s and 90s with any Phantom Thief in their depiction in anime and manga. And I'm going to get into a few more specific examples in a couple minutes, but that is something that you will start seeing from here on out. Now, in the years after Nijimenso became popular in Japan, Japan also wholeheartedly embraced the Arsène Lupin stories that inspired them. So there are many, 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 many versions of Lupin in Japanese media. This is the manga Aventurier, which is basically just a straight-up adaptation of the original LeBlanc stories. So the script of the comic is translated text from LeBlanc's books. They are just the original Arsène Lupin stories. And then they are illustrated with artwork by Morita Takeshi. And it's a fairly nice adaptation. Like visually, it's good artwork. It's just the original stories. So if you're a fan of the LeBlanc stories, or even if you haven't read them yet, they are quite good. But you will notice right here, Lupin is holding playing cards, and that has become shorthand along with the top hat, cape, monocle, evening dress that in Japan has become shorthand for a Phantom Thief as well. And you're going to see more of that too. There are a bunch of other adaptations of the Lupin stories, or characters named after him, or dating sims featuring him. I cannot even tell you how many properties Lupin shows up in. Japan has actually reimagined Lupin's character more than any non-francophone country. So outside of France and other French-speaking countries, Japan has more versions of Lupin than any other country in the world. And they've done it in every possible genre. Like you have literary adventure stories, you have shonen manga, you have dating sims. I mean, it's Lupin's everywhere, and live action, and anime, and everything. Video games. Of course, the best known of these is actually not an adaptation. They just took the name. So Lupin III, which is, it's hard to sum this up. It's probably the best known of all the Japanese Lupin variations, despite the fact that it has almost nothing to do with the original. And it's honestly it's the only reason that a lot of younger fans know that Lupin is a thing. And Lupin Sansei started as a manga in the 1960s, and it was much more of a James Bond spoof than it was a Phantom Thief series. Allegedly, Lupin III is the grandson of Arsène Lupin. However, they didn't have permission to use the name, so this created some copyright issues, and when it was localized to different countries, they had to change his name, including in America. The first release of Lupin Sansei in America was Rupan, R-U-P-A-N, the third, because they could not get permission to use Lupin. That's the way it goes, apparently. In any case, it's very much spy-based, but it is also incredibly successful. So there are more than 40 titles in this series in just the anime and film versions. There's a stage musical, there are video games, there are a couple of live action films, there are crossovers with other series. I cannot even begin to describe how influential this is. But the interesting thing is, it has really spawned its own influence, but it's using Lupin's name, but it's not actually tied in at all. The most tie-ins you get are in the names and the titles. So in one of the earlier film installments, by earlier I mean 1980s, not like 1960s. This film is best known for having been directed by Miyazaki before he was famous. But the Castle of Cagliostro, which is based on the title of an actual Maurice LeBlanc book. They borrow the titles, they borrow the character names, they borrow some of the events, but the stories and characters are fundamentally different. However, in the original, so this is the first anime adaptation of Lupin Sansei. The manga started in 1967. This was the first anime in 1969. And Akechi Kogoro, who did, play a part in all of this because he was inspired by Sherlock Holmes and all these other detective stories, does appear as a character in the original Monkey Punch series. He has not shown up, as far as I know, in any of the later adaptations. But they stole from everyone. You've got Akechi Kogoro and Lupin borrowed without permission of their creators. And on its own, Lupin III inspired many imitators. I mean, you've got elements of his character in Spike Spiegel from Cowboy Bebop. Nabeshin, who's on the left here, he's a super famous Japanese director who always dresses in this manner. It's just a personal trademark. And Lupin Sansei is really iconic for its disregard of physics in chase scenes and its fight scenes and its fan service, all involving the character of Mine Fujiko, who finally got her own series to have fan service in. It's all very influential and been copied frequently. And in an appropriately circular crossover, Japan's most famous contemporary thief, who's named after Arsène Lupin, was mashed up with Japan's most famous contemporary detective, who's named after Edgar Allan Poe and Arthur Conan Doyle. That would be Edogawa Conan, the title character of Detective Conan, which we have mentioned several times, and also needs to be mentioned as a very important, influential representation in this discussion. So, if you haven't heard of the series, Detective Conan is it's kind of like Encyclopedia Brown if Encyclopedia Brown were also the Law and Order of Japan. Like, it's the show that everybody has seen at some point because it's been on television for a quarter century, and even if they aren't dedicated fans, people are familiar with it. Japan has an airport named after the series. It has postage stamp collections named after the series. There are several large-scale museum exhibits of this series going on at any given time in Japan. The manga is currently like the 20th longest running manga in history. It might actually be higher than that. I haven't checked in a year or two. Um, this manga is more than twice as long as Dragon Ball. It is an incredibly popular and influential series, and it is a mystery series featuring a child detective. So, like I said, Encyclopedia Brown with a lot more murder and organized crime. Um, and he's really a high schooler who got shrunk by some mysterious drug and turned into a 7-year-old who is now perpetually stuck in elementary school and goes around solving murders. That's really the plot of the show. But what's fun for mystery fans is that the mangaka, Aoyama Gosho, includes homages to famous literary detectives throughout the series. Almost every single character or location in this series is named after either a famous mystery author or a literary detective. So your main character is Edogawa Conan. The source of his name is Edogawa Rampo and Arthur Conan Doyle. His girlfriend is Mori Dan, who is named after Maurice LeBlanc, which is, the parts of those names are pronounced that way in Japanese. Her father's name is Kogoro, who is named after Akechi Kogoro. Their professor friend is Agasa Hiroshi, who is named after Agatha Christie. The police inspector is Megure, who's named after Jules Maigret, who's a famous, it just, you've also got the Shonen Tanteidan, you've got, they live in the Beika prefecture next to the Temuzu River, which is Baker and Thames. The list goes on. I could probably spend 30 minutes just naming things that are named after things in this series. The other thing it has that's worth noting is actually predates Detective Conan. It has what is probably the most famous current Phantom Thief character in Japan. While Lupin III may be the biggest commercial success that uses the name, he doesn't really fit the traditional Phantom Thief mold the way that some of these other characters do because it's more of a spy parody than anything else. The character who is a much closer match is Kaito Kid from Magic Kaito and Detective Conan. Now, Magic Kaito is actually not original to Detective Conan. He first appeared in his own manga, Magic Kaito, in 1987. It was also written by Aoyama Gosho. And then later, after Aoyama Gosho wrote Detective Conan, and it became popular, he just put Kaito Kid in it in several cameos, and that worked out really well, so he just kept doing it. So Kaito Kid is now a recurring character in Detective Conan as well, and has gotten his own spin-off series a few times too. Magic Kaito is still technically an ongoing series, though they only release a new chapter every few years, so it's really just side story to Detective Conan at this point. So in this series, the main character, whose name is actually Kaito, yes, it's a bad pun because everything is puns, he is the son of a prominent stage magician who died under mysterious circumstances, and he is trying to solve his father's murder, and to do that, he is pulling off jewel heists. And he uses magic tricks and illusions, so you're going to see a lot of references to magic and playing cards and pulling doves out of his hat and that sort of thing. Much like Nijimenso, he's also a master of disguise. He just whips his cape over his head and turns into anybody he wants. But it's all disguise. It's not magic. But unlike Nijimenso, he is not motivated by greed because he actually always gives back whatever he steals. He just steals the jewel, checks to see if it's the one he's looking for, and then gives it back. So it's more of a vengeance motivated thing because he's trying to track down the criminal organization that he believes killed his father, who his father was the original Kaito Kid. Kid is actually, this is complicated, but Kid is a misreading of the numbers 1412, which was his international criminal ID. It's a long story, but that's why it's Kaito Kid. And so Kaito is trying to steal the jewel before the evil bad guys get the jewels, yada yada. They are not shy about acknowledging their literary roots. So Kaito's mother is called the female Nijimenso, and Kaito's father is Kaito Kid, who deliberately designs his costume as an homage to Arsène Lupin. So that is the in-series reason for them. He's the kid of two famous Phantom Thieves. Also, he needed a cape so his costume can turn into a hang glider, because that's another thing that happens. So in 2012, they finally did a Magic Kaito adaptation of the original manga rather than just his part in Detective Conan, which I can't show you, but it's a full. There's the specials at the beginning and then a full 24 episode series, and I'm sure you can find at least the opening on some streaming site online, YouTube or whatever, if you just want to see what it looks like. And you will notice, if you ever do watch any of this, you'll see a lot of the same Phantom Thief tropes showing up. So you'll have disguise and illusion and the top hat, monocle, cape, all of those things that characterize what we have come to recognize as the iconic Phantom Thief appearance. Um, and of course, other Phantom Thief characters populate dozens of anime and manga all through, as I said, the 80s and 90s is when it gets really, really big. One of them that a lot of Western audiences are familiar with, but don't necessarily recognize as a Phantom Thief, is Tuxedo Common from Sailor Moon, or Tuxedo Mask if you are doing the American version. Now, if you're familiar with Sailor Moon, you may be thinking, like, wait, Tuxedo Mask is just a guy who throws roses at people. He's not a Phantom Thief. Actually, he is, or he was before they rewrote this series and removed it. So, way back when, in 1992, you may notice some similarities here. Uh, when in the original manga and the very early stages of the anime, which was coming out at almost the same time because the anime was coming out just weeks after the manga did, um, Tuxedo Common was in fact meant to be a Phantom Thief, which was at the time a really popular trope for shoujo romance series. In the late 80s, early 90s, there were tons, like dozens of other series where the love interest in the series was a Phantom Thief type character. And Tuxedo Common absolutely fits this casting call. You know, his whole wardrobe is modeled on Arsène Lupin. He spends the first part of the series stealing jewels and making announcements about it to the press. Um, and the way they tied this in was early on in the series, everybody's searching for a gem called the Ginzuisho, the Silver Crystal, and lacking any other means of tracking it down, Tuxedo Kama decides the best way to go about it is to go steal a bunch of jewels and see if they're magical, which, surprisingly, it doesn't appear. But then once the crystal is revealed, which happens only a few chapters into the story, really, he no longer has any reason to play Jewel Thief, so he doesn't. And apart from that, he also got kidnapped and brainwashed, which distracted him for a while, so he stopped being a jewel thief. But if you don't remember that, if you have seen Sailor Moon or read Sailor Moon and you don't remember that happening in the series, there are a couple of possible reasons. First, the Sailor Moon manga has been completely rewritten a couple of times since its original release in 92. So the Japanese reissues actually contain a different script than what was originally published, and the American reissues adapted that further, so it's even more of a different script than what was originally published. And second, the original 1993 series anime kind of just glossed over the fact that Tuxedo Common was committing robberies. I think it only comes up once in passing, like they mention it in one episode and then never say anything about it again. Sailor Moon Crystal, which came out a few years ago, actually does mention it, I think, a few more times, but it's still not a focal point. And the other thing that happened was if you read the English adaptations of the manga, neither of the two US commercial releases that have been done use any of the terminology typically associated with Phantom Thief characters, because that archetype is not as recognizable here as it is in Japan. And in the case of the first release, the script was heavily localized and changed dramatically to make it marketable to American audiences. But if you read the original manga, it's really clear that the earlier incarnation of the character was a Phantom Thief, because they're talking about him making statements to the mass media and stealing things and committing crimes and all of that. And it's because that romantic Kaito angle was a really popular trope in the late 80s, early 90s. Excuse me. So unfortunately, most of Tuxedo Common's thief storyline got wiped out in transition, and so did his so did his useful powers and abilities. Like, remember in the manga when he actually did things instead of just standing around throwing roses? Sorry. I used to watch Sailor Moon when I was much younger, so I'm bitter. On a directly related note, the precursor to Sailor Moon, the manga codenamed Sailor V, which was the which was written immediately before Sailor Moon by the same mangaka and was later retconned into a prequel series, and Sailor V became Sailor Venus, also featured a Phantom Thief character named Kaito Ace, who was basically the proto-Tuxedo Common. So, if you had any doubt about Tuxedo Common being a Phantom Thief, just you look a couple years earlier and, oh yeah, no, he's even got the same mask. It's the same guy. And speaking of Phantom Thieves in anime and powers and late 80s and 90s. Following the fantasy sci-fi wave that swept through popular culture in the 80s, if you remember all the bad sword and sorcery films in the 80s, and then like everything went kind of cyberpunk in the 90s, well, the same thing happened in Phantom Thief land. So there was a rash in the 90s of paranormal Phantom Thieves, and one of these, probably the best known to the average anime viewer, was Dark Mousy from the manga and anime D and Angel. Kaito Dark is a thief who is magically coded into the DNA of a particular family, so he manifests in one member per generation and they transform into him. And of course, naturally, he has a nemesis who is coded into the DNA of a different bloodline, one of whom happens to be the son of a rival detective, and yada yada. Kaito Dark is primarily an art thief, and of course he's doing it for altruistic reasons. He's just targeting pieces of art created by a family of artists who imbued them with harmful powers, because that's a thing. And he's a little bit more modern in appearance than most Kaito that we think of in the Edwardian dress, so he wears more of the tight black cat burglar outfits that you think of. And he also has magical wings, because shoujo manga. But he does follow the exact same behavior pattern, where he sends out advance notices for things he intends to steal, and he generally just puts on a show. And also flirts a lot with girls. Um, and the inclusion of supernatural elements in Kaito stories was also really common in, the shoujo manga genre just really liked Kaito in a lot of things in the 80s and 90s. But it corresponds with that trend of portraying thieves as secret heroes who are working to protect humanity. And frequently these characters were either pretending to steal objects because they were actually dangerous and needed to be disposed of, which is what D and Angel did, or sometimes they were directly combating criminal groups, which is what Magic Kaito and Detective Conan did, or they were working to restore stolen property to its rightful owner, or whatever. It's kind of like creators finally caught on that their audience was going to be rooting for the thief character anyway, so they might as well make them the protagonists, which some of them, like Raffles, had always been the protagonist. But another supernatural thief that you can track this trend to can be found in the manga and anime Kamikaze Kaito Jana, which I swear I did not make this plot up. There's a young girl whose thief counterpart is actually the reincarnation of Joan of Arc, and she fights demons using the power of rhythm gymnastics. I absolutely guarantee that is the actual plot of the series. So apart from stealing paintings that have been possessed by evil spirits, because that seems to happen a lot in Japan, she does all the usual Kaito things like sending out advance notices and facing off against a detective, who in this case is also her real-life best friend, because fighting crime and being a detective is apparently also what middle school students do for fun. There's a lot that, my middle school life was never this interesting when I was a kid. Japan gets all the cool stuff. Sometimes the supernatural in these cases is taken to extremes, as in the Matante Loki series. There was Matante Loki, which was a manga, followed by Matante Loki Ragnarok. And in this case, the local phantom thief is actually the Norse god Freyr from the Norse pantheon, who's just visiting Earth to harass Loki, who is trapped in the body of a young child. He rides his flying mechanical pig, Golenbrusti, to escape his crime scenes, and his nemesis, of course, is the titular detective Loki, who is the actual Loki, who got condemned to being a kid on Earth because Odin kicked him out of Asgard, and so he runs a supernatural detective agency in Japan, because that's what little kids do. And this series was very definitely kind of an answer to Detective Conan. Even the title is a play on Meitante Conan, which is the Japanese title of Detective Conan is Meitante Conan, which is Great Detective Conan. So this is Matante Loki, which is supernatural. Ma means supernatural or mythical. So mythical detective Loki. It's a pun, because everything is puns. So while we're on the anime section, this is a fairly new series. I think it only came out June of last year. So it's actually less than a year old at this point that I'm speaking right now, and it's not strictly a Phantom Thief example, but I did want to mention it because it ties into the literary history that we talked about. So this is the Woodpecker Detective Agency, is what that translates to, and it's based on a mystery novel, and it's basically the story of all of Japan's most famous Meiji era literary figures, reimagined as pretty boys, and they join up and form a detective agency in 1909 Asakusa in Tokyo. So this guy you're looking at right here is the anime counterpart. He is actually Hirai Taro, who would go on to become Edogawa Ranpo, who is a character in this series. So there are a bunch of other famous Meiji era writers and poets in this series, but I think it's interesting because it's an adaptation of the era in which all of this literary adaptation was going on. So you get some references to various works and authors and things going on there too. And we have our little bonus round. I added this section for Gen Con, which is a gaming convention, and so I've left it in here because honestly it ties in really closely. And this is where you see some of the most specific adaptations based on the original tropes. So this Gentleman Thieves board game is actually based directly on Arsène Lupin. I think the original title of the game was just Arsène Lupin, and it was developed in France. And then when they localized it for American sales, they said, "Wait, does anybody in America read?" I think they just assumed that Lupin was not as known here, so they renamed it to Gentlemen Thieves. But it is it's a board game based on Gentlemen Thieves, and you have to steal certain items and collect certain things before your nemesis, before your counterparts do. Um, for tabletop gamers, Pathfinder has a Phantom Thief character archetype, which is pretty darn straightforward. This is from the Ultimate Intrigue sourcebook. One of my RPG characters is a Phantom Thief, and it's built on a rogue structure, but then you also have additional abilities, and you can appraise things and disguise yourself, and lots of other stuff. And it's fun because, of course, I had to play a Phantom Thief, once that became available. Sadly, I believe this is only in original Pathfinder 1.0, and Pathfinder 2.0 does not currently have a Phantom Thief. But if you're playing old school and not like PFS 2.0, you can still play one. The obvious video game example is Persona 5, which is basically a game about Phantom Thieves. That is literally the whole game. And it's very stylized and modern. So a lot of this has, supernatural imagery and mecha imagery and other stuff going on. But if you look at the top hat and the mask and the monocle, like in that logo on the right there, you definitely have a nod to the Raffles and Lupin images that were so iconic. So you have masks and you have hats and you have capes and you have things like that. Excuse me. And characters in the game also give notice before committing the theft, and they're acting to bring otherwise untouchable criminals to justice rather than for personal gain. So despite how slick and modern it looks, it still is tying in very closely to those archetypes. The Sly Cooper series, this is something I didn't know until relatively recently because I had never seen the game in Japanese, but the Sly Cooper series was originally in Japanese called Kaito Sly Cooper, and he is a Kaito. In America, they dropped the Kaito, and it's just Sly Cooper, and he happens to be a thief. So obviously, you've got a lot less of the Victorian or Edwardian aesthetic here, but you do have some of those elements that were intended from the original Japanese. There's a digital collectible card game, which that concept amuses me anyway, but a 2015 digital collectible card game called Ensemble Stars, and it features an entire boy band number about Phantom Thieves, complete with Phantom Thief costumes. And so you've got your capes and your top hats and all your things. Very definitely influenced. Phoenix Wright has a character who in the English adaptation his name is Mask to Mask. In the original Japanese, it is Kaijin Kamen Mask, which is Fiend Mask. So yeah, he's a definite nod to Kaijin Nijimenso because you've got the Kaijin as opposed to Kaito, and Kamen and Mask. Kamen means mask, so definitely a guy wearing a mask. Definitely a mask. Vocaloid has some very definite Kaito-inspired costumes and lyrics. The title of this number translates to Black Cat the Phantom Thief, and the lyrics are extremely specific. You've got putting out advance notice about your crime and using disguise, and you've got the silk hat, the monocle, all of those things. Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Both have Phantom Thieves. Nothing exists in Japan that does not have a Phantom Thief, I am convinced. Pokemon, it's not in every game, but there is a Kaito Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh has a character or a card, a single card that is the Kaito, the Phantom Thief card. More recently, Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is the new version comes out this summer, but the first game, which came out last year, has a character who is the Slum Angel. In the English adaptation, they change her name to the Guardian Angel of the Slum, but in Japanese, they are literally just saying Slum Angel. That's what they call her. But she is the mysterious thief who acts in the interest of the slum residents and leaves calling cards behind. And there is an entire side quest involving going around and finding the Slum Angel's calling cards and tracking stuff down and finding out who that is. Then there's Code Realize. Code Realize now has an anime adaptation too. I think it may be available for streaming in the US on Crunchyroll. I have not actually checked, but it was originally your average dating sim, and it has the prettiest Arsène Lupin you have ever seen. Look at that outfit. That is just very, very pretty. And then you also have this version, which is British Detective Mysteria, which honestly has too many options because you have a bunch of different detectives and criminals and other things going on. So here you have not only Arsène Lupin, but you have Phantom Thief Lupin Jr. So they are actually father and son in the game, and that is the extent I know about them, was reading that they are father and son in the game, because I've not actually played this game, and wow, I do not remember any of my Lupin books having those illustrations. I can't show you this video because, again, DMCA stuff. So there is a Phantom Thief rhythm game called Rhythm Thief, which is entirely too enjoyable because you not only do thief-like things like sneaking into museums and avoiding police and guards and running over rooftops, but you also play soccer and throw treats to your dog, all with good rhythm. But, rhythm games aren't really known for their in-depth plot, so we'll go with it. Here are a bunch of other examples that I did not have the time or space to put into here because this panel is supposed to only be 2 hours long. I sometimes fail at that. But hopefully the overview you have has given you some background on the Phantom Thief archetype, where it comes from, also some insight into the references that are made in comics and games and programs featuring these characters. And if you are interested in learning more, I encourage you to check out your public library or your streaming service of choice. And just as a note there are 2 screens of bibliographies here that I'm putting up for you. This is not a complete bibliography. These are the books I pulled quotes or specific information from. I literally have an entire barrister's case in my house and 2 additional bookshelves full of books relating to this genre. That's only the ones I own, not the ones I got from the library. I am kind of a nerd. But what that means is, if you have any specific questions about, hey, I am really curious to know about this particular character, or I can't find any information on this story, can you help me out? I might be able to look that up for you, so feel free to contact me. Here's the second page of the bibliography if you are screenshotting anything. Most of these books should be available from your local library or from, interlibrary loan, or if not, they should all be in print, I think. So you should be able to find copies of them. And if you do have questions or comments or feedback of any kind, this is where you can find me. Most of our stuff deals with cosplay because that's what we're kind of known for, but I am also a big enough nerd that I like to talk about lots of other topics. So feel free to contact me. There's an email form on the website, or you can hit us up on social media and ask me any questions you have. And if any of you happen to be at a convention where I'm presenting this in person, I hope you stop by and watch the video clips that I could not show you today. Thank you very much for hanging out and listening to me ramble on about the Phantom Thief archetype, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your event.